So platelets, well, in this micro talk, I'm going to mainly focus on the receptors on the platelets. But before that, just to recap, now we're doing primary hemostasis, and it's all about vessel wall, the quality of the vessel wall, and platelets. And the thing you should understand is that the primary hemostasis is going to end with a platelet plug, which is a good structure that is able to block bleeding, but only temporarily. And it needs still something more to fix it. And the thing that fixes it is the fibrin mesh, which is the secondary hemostasis. And also that's why the clinical signs are different if there's something with the primary hemostasis or secondary. And in this part, from the primary hemostasis, we're going to discuss the platelet function. The vessel wall is going to be discussed in the pathophysiology section. So let's start with platelets. Platelets are made out of megacaryocytes, and that is through their disruption. So one megakaryocyte, through its disruption, is able to produce about 1,000 platelets. And the lifespan of a platelet is about 10 days. In platelets, there are more types of granules, but the ones I want to mention are alpha granules and dense granules. The alpha granules, they store fibrinogen, von Willebrand's factor, and factor V. The dense granules store ADP. And now let's get to basic features of platelets, and those are adhesion, activation, and aggregation. And the thing I want you to understand is that these processes, if you want, happen at once. It's very hard to say what happens first. And basically, we divide this only because of educational reasons. But if I give you an example, let's say adhesion and activation, it depends what started the first, because the platelet can be activated by adhesion first, or it can be activated also by some other substances like thrombin. So the thing I want you to understand is that we artificially divided these processes. We separated them, but they happen at once. And in some platelets, first is activation and then adhesion or aggregation. And in some platelets are activated by adhesion or aggregation. Okay, so just to recap, what is adhesion? Adhesion means adhesion of a platelet to damaged vessel wall. And platelets can use many molecules and factors, if you want, to bind to the damaged vessel wall. But the ones and the main ones I want you to remember is collagen and von Willebrand's factor. Okay, and now activation. What is activation? Activation of a platelet. Well, this basically means a transformation of a platelet from its resting state into its active state. And this includes many processes, but the two processes that I would really like to stress is the platelet shape change and the platelet secretion. And what is behind the platelet shape change? Well, it's a dramatic change where basically a smooth, round platelet changes into a platelet with many sort of spike-like pseudopods. And this is a cytoskeletally driven process. And with this, the platelets really massively increase their surface. The other process is the granule secretion, the secretion of the alpha and dense granules. With this, the thrombocytes are able to activate other nearby thrombocytes, but not only this, they're able to activate themselves through autocrine fashion. The last feature is called aggregation, and aggregation of platelets mean that they bind to each other. And for this binding, they use free-floating von Willebrand's factor or also free-floating fibrinogen. Okay, now let's get to the platelet receptors. And the reason to know at least some of the receptors is because their mutations can cause a disease. And not only this, but also the drugs which are used for some of the diseases are aiming on these receptors or their ligands. So let's first of all go through the receptors that are responsible for adhesion. And the first receptor I want to mention is the GP1b receptor, where GP stands for glycoprotein. And GP1b receptor is able to bind von Willebrand's factor, but watch out, it's a special thing where the von Willebrand's factor has to be first immobilized on a surface. And in this case, it means immobilized as it is attached to collagen. Another receptor I want to mention is the GP1a receptor. And this receptor platelets use to bind directly to collagen. And still one more receptor I want to mention, and it is the GP6 receptor. And this receptor works the same way as GP1a because both of these receptors the platelets use to bind directly to collagen. Alright, and now let's get to the receptors responsible for platelet activation. And the first receptor is the P2Y12 receptor. And this receptor is activated by ATP. Alright, and important thing to mention over here is a drug that is able to block this receptor. And the drug is called clopidogrel. And clopidogrel is used a lot by cardiologists, especially in treatment of MI. Another receptor that is important for platelet activation is called the thromboxane receptor. And guess what it binds? Well, naturally it binds thromboxane A2. And if you recall the production of thromboxane, the COX-1 enzyme is the one which cells use, and also platelets, to produce thromboxane. And the drug that blocks the COX-1 enzyme is aspirin. So aspirin is the one which blocks the production of thromboxane A2. And I want to stress over here that, watch out, it's the blockage of the ligand, not the receptor, not the thromboxane receptor, but blockage of the production of the ligand. And the thing about aspirin is that aspirin is the most used drug for treatment or prevention of MI. And typically cardiologists use aspirin in combination with clopidogrel for treatment of MI. Okay, and still one more receptor that is worth to mention, and it triggers activation, platelet activation, is the PAR1 receptor. And this receptor is activated by thrombin. And this is very important because the main player in the coagulation cascade, which thrombin definitely is activating platelets as well. And again, over here you can see that although we divide the hemostasis on primary and secondary, the division is only artificial because both systems are massively interconnected. Alright, and what about aggregation? Well, the receptor responsible for aggregation is a receptor called GP2B3A. And this GP2B3A receptor, interestingly, is a receptor that is able to bind free-floating, I want to stress, free-floating von Willebrand's factor. And not only this, but also free-floating fibrinogen. Watch out, not fibrin, but fibrinogen. And the platelets use this receptor for aggregation. And the cool thing is that nowadays we have a special drug. And why special? Well, because it's a specially prepared antibody aiming on this 2B3A receptor. And although it's an expensive drug, we can still use it in really severe, dangerous cases of thrombus formation, and we use it to block the platelet aggregation. And the drug I'm talking about is called abciximab. Okay, so let's summarize it. So one megacaryocyte is able to produce about 1,000 platelets, and the lifespan of one platelet is about 10 days. Platelets have alpha granules and dense granules. And the alpha granules, they store fibrinogen, von Willebrand's factor, and factor V. Dense granules store ADP. The main features of platelets are adhesion, activation, and aggregation. And although we divide these, and we divide it artificially, you should look at these features as whether that they react simultaneously. And finally, to summarize the receptors of platelets, so the receptors responsible for adhesion are GP1b receptor, and this receptor binds mainly von Willebrand's factor, but this von Willebrand's factor has to be attached to collagen already. Then there is GP1a receptor that is able to bind collagen directly, and the same accounts for GP6 receptor, which also binds collagen directly. Then there are receptors responsible for activation. The first one is the P2Y12 receptor, which is activated by ADP. And very importantly, a drug called clopidogrel is able to block this receptor. So it blocks the activation of platelets. Then there is a thromboxane receptor, TR, which binds thromboxane A2. Indirectly, we could understand that this is blocked by aspirin, but the production of thromboxane A2. And then there is PAR1 receptor, which binds thrombin and is activated by thrombin. Well, and the last process, which is aggregation, is mediated by GP2B/3A receptor, and this receptor is able to bind free-floating von Willebrand's factor, and not only this, but also free-floating fibrinogen. And we have a special drug which is able to block this receptor in case of massive aggregation, and this drug is called abciximab. Well, so this was about formation of a platelet plaque, which is the ending process, or this is where the primary hemostasis leads to. This platelet plaque is unstable, so we still need to stabilize it by fibrin mesh, and that's the final product of the secondary hemostasis, or in other words, coagulation. So let's delete this, and we're going to continue with coagulation cascade. So thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.